interest in this because in my more adventuresome times, I had a Klepper sea kayak with a sail rig, and I did many thousand miles at sea, living out of my kayak between the Hawaiian Islands and the coast of California and the coast of Chile and other parts of the world, including Antarctica. And I used to take it with me on my duties aboard the Lindblad Explorer, where I worked for many years with Lindblad at the ends of the world. But on my off time, I'd drop my kayak in the water and just go away, and hopefully get back in time before the ship sailed. And so when I was reading about traditional navigation techniques, the Polynesians have by far the most advanced in the world. And I've been I'm a licensed Coast Guard master, so I've had to study celestial navigation and other meteorology and all that sort of stuff to be able to find my way around the sea. But the Polynesians have certainly had a remarkable voyaging culture. And a lot of the question is whether they voyaged intentionally or whether they just drifted and found the islands, or what was the real motivation behind this great exploration of the world. That's one of the great voyaging canoes, which is now, oops, sorry, my PowerPoint is again not working. You'll have to pardon me because it works on my computer but not on the screen. Well, anyway, I'll go back and start over again. How's that? And no, I'm not getting anywhere. Well, we'll take a island break here, but it doesn't move on the screen. There we go. See, this is why one should always have a spare paddle at all times, just in case. All right, there we go. All right, we're going to start over again. Aha, there we go. That's what we need, another ocean view across the great blue world, or they call it in Polynesian Moana Nui, that's the great blue. And this is the home of these people. And you read about their mythology and their conception of the world, and they have as the basis of the creation of humanity having been made by the sky and the water, but not necessarily the land. And they have this saying called Atearoa, which means the great immense void out of which all that we experience was formed. And that is above all the ocean. So you have this great expanse of water, and we've covered how many thousands of miles? 6,000 from Tahiti just to Auckland. And then now, of course, we've just crossed over into the going to Western Australia. But we took that course all the way from Los Angeles down to French Polynesia and to the Cook Islands. Well, now this isn't working either. And then down to New Zealand, around and above. And this is very much in the heartland of all of the maritime nations and territories. And this just shows you where they are. French Polynesia still being a département of France, the last great piece of French territory. And one of our guests aboard when we were in Polynesia, and I was talking about it, and I talked about the Polynesian revival and claims that Polynesia should be its own country and they should unite all these different islands and peoples. And he said France will never give up La Belle Polynésie. He said it's the woman that we always want to dance with. That's how he described it, La Damselle. Anyway, we've come down through that whole area, but you can see how a lot of these areas were given independence, for better and for worse, after the decolonization. But this is only the recent history. The ancient history is still being researched as to where the people came from. Nowadays, the DNA evidence has shown that the original Polynesian people came from Southeast Asia, Taiwan, in the Vietnamese area. They're not sure quite where they were, but the DNA evidence goes right back to what they call the Montagnard, or the mountain people on the Asian coast, and they came at a time when the seas had already flooded, so that in Melanesia, all the islands to the west, which is in the Greek term means the dark islands, because the people are more negro and different looking than what they call the copper-toned Polynesians. There is a mixture through those islands, but the Polynesians kept going and came out all the way to the Cook Islands Society, the French Polynesia, the Marquesas, about 150 BC. The earliest archaeological evidence is actually in the Marquesas, which is a long way. Then Easter Island later about 500 AD. And you can see there's another 1,000 miles to the South American coast. So it is a question of why did they go and how did they get there? Because the winds and the currents are mostly from the east to the west. And so this is very much upwind sailing or discovery through all this area. And so this has led to some of the researchers thinking these were people driven either by necessity and that they had been kicked out of their island or land by a warfare, or they were overpopulated, they overextended their resources, and then they, as a culture, just would get in their voyaging canoes and get supplies, and they would go look for land to have a new start. And this is where the Polynesians have been famous sailors and very brave people who were willing to go out into nowhere to find a new place. Well, we have already crossed this, the Great Polynesian Triangle, which goes from Hawaii down to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and down to New Zealand, by far the largest of the Polynesian group. I mean, New Zealand alone is many, many times larger than all of the other islands put together. It is a continental island, as we saw when we were there, with mountains and rivers and plains and such. Quite different than the culture on all these other little islands, which are often reefs, atolls, mountainous islands. Now, we've already seen plenty of them, and we've heard plenty about them. This is one in the Tuamotus in eastern French Polynesia, and it's typical of the atoll formation around a center that may have had a mountain in between. It may have settled into the sea, and then the coral keeps growing up and building a rim like this. But you can imagine crossing in a canoe and you couldn't see anything really on the horizon. You see these little specks of land way out there. Now, this is a picture from a ship, so you can actually see far. But if you're at sea level, you can hardly see a mile at the most. And that's why they call those the dangerous archipelago, because ships would just come upon them and suddenly be wrecked. They wouldn't know. Now they're settled, some of them. I mean, there's hundreds of islands, and some of them are settled, some of them are not. But in colonial times, they were lighthouses and then radio beacons, LORAN, all these things put in to help the navigation. Once the local knowledge was lost, then you have a group like the Fiji Islands, were high mountainous volcanic islands. You could see those from afar, and they were generally much more conducive to the settlements. And of course, it's the Pali coast of Hawaii, one of the more dramatic of these great volcanic islands in the Pacific. But again, if you're in a canoe and you're paddling around, you run into something like this, this is not where you want to land. This is actually off of Rapa Nui and Easter Island, which has very few harbors and no coral reef around it. So a lot of these islands are almost unapproachable and uninhabitable even. But the canoe technology is what led this great migration. This is in Melanesia, the kind of dugout wooden canoes that were common still to this day. And then they added the outrigger. This led to the development of the modern catamaran. That actually is originally probably from India and the Indian Ocean down through what's now Indonesia, Melanesia, came out to Polynesia with the local, what they call the va, or the single canoe for local commerce and travel around, sort of like just the average car. Later, they built much larger canoes that could hold up to 50, 60 people. This is on Nukuhiva in the Marquesas, an ancient carving of the original settlers who came on voyaging canoes with all their supplies, usually coconuts, sweet potato, pigs, chickens, rats they eat. And so they would have the provisions to keep going. They'd collect water from the rain. And then they had a sail technology that would get them across these seas. So this is one of the earliest of the carvings in the Marquesas of, you can see what's called the crab style sail, which was lost in time but has recently been revived. And this is seems quite fragile when it was found in these old pictures in the Santa Cruz Islands. Either this is a kind of a sprit rig with a rectangular sail, or they would build them larger. Here's a bailer just for good luck out there. But here's another illustration from, I think this is D'Urville, the French writer, wrote about how these lateen sail rigs were so efficient that they couldn't, they would sail circles around the European lumbering vessels and they couldn't even catch them. You see they're using paddles for steering, outriggers, and when they were larger, they'd have many pontoons like this, whether they were carved wood or else they were planked coconut planks that were joined with coconut thread and breadfruit sap that they'd seal them, and then they would have a woven mat as a sail over the cabin and the other platforms for the voyaging canoe. And you see the telltale kino, that's the wind vane off of the stern there. And some of these were still sailing in the 1950s. This is an old picture of David Lewis's about the Santa Cruz Island vessels that were still traveling, trading within those islands. The European colonists usually banned that because they said, well, we have ships, or the bigger schooners, and they gave the trade over to the colonists. But some of them, in isolated parts of Polynesia, they still had crafts like this, which may seem very fragile. But you notice that tremendous crab sail, which is, at sea, it's pretty efficient because it'll catch a higher wind in light wind. But when there is a squall or a gale, they can just literally lower the whole rig down and it will not destroy the boat. And they will be, well, it doesn't look like they exactly have lounges and buffet lines on that boat, but they still build ones like this in the Philippines and down through Indonesia, called a praha, or different names for it, with a kind of a spider-like catamaran. Now, this is a motorized one, but it's typical of the Polynesian style of adaptability in the construction of the boats. But once you have the boat, you have to have the knowledge to go where you wish and why. And David Lewis, the writer, sailor from New Zealand, he had been studying this academically. He said, well, I have to go find people who actually have this knowledge. And he went to the Santa Cruz Islands and found this gentleman, Tevate, who was one of the last of the voyaging wayfinders, it's called in the local language, that he said, I'll take you on a trip using my knowledge of the islands and the stars and the different qualities of the sea without a compass, without a sextant, no modern equipment. And he would sit in a kind of a meditative pose on the bow of the vessel and watch the water, watch the birds, watch the cloud. And he taught David Lewis how the technique worked. And here he is steering for a while. You can see sort of a sideboard steering paddle, what we call the starboard paddle, without a center-hung rudder, which was a later development. But being so close to the water, they were very much one with the element. And it's been said that the human brain has a hypothalamus ability of sensing direction through many different means, like birds and other animals who know where they are by wind, sky, terrain. And so these navigators had a, let's say, a comprehensive sense of where they were just by all these many indicators without needing modern assistance. Of course, they were in their local waters and they, above all, knew where they were at night. As they say in Hawaiian, when you get offshore, then you discover the sky. And here's a night scene with the guide would be, in this case, a shell sighting instrument where you would take the angle of whatever celestial body, a star or a planet, and you would then be able to determine your latitude. And this is just like a modern sextant without all the mathematics attached to it, but with a very careful observation, they could tell their latitude fairly easily. And then they had other celestial markers, particularly the Southern Cross, which we were seeing back on the time in New Zealand, where the constellation will pick up as the night goes on, and when it is perfectly vertical in the center of this, then that is due south. In the north you have Polaris, which is a true North Star, but in the southern hemisphere you'll watch for the Southern Cross. And then you can judge your direction that way generally. But you have all these different stars in the sky, and what they provide is a point of rising on the horizon and then setting in the morning in another part of the horizon, and that is a very clear indicator of your latitude. Again, longitude is the problem. But all these islands in Polynesian would have their own zenith star, which means at the middle of the night there would be one star directly above their island, and they would refer to their island as the son or daughter of that particular star, and they would say that star speaks to them when they go out traveling, because they'll see it over there and they know that their island is over there. And so you have the rising and falling of the stars, and this is standard in celestial navigation, but in Polynesian it became a, let's say, a spiritual and a cosmic view of the world, where there were many layers of reality and appearance. And this is again from the Tuamotus, where one of the wayfinders described the cosmology of the past down below, the deceased, the world on the present, and then the world of the sky and the communication with the sky. This is a chart that was made in the 1830s with a rudimentary description of what it was, and it's still a mystery because a lot of that knowledge has been lost, the spiritual knowledge, but the navigation knowledge is still there. So this again is out of the book with David Lewis, who took Tevate on his own Western-style rigged boat, and he followed Pollux forward. He kept the Great Bear, Ursa, in the rigging. So they're obviously heading northwest, the pole star. They're in the northern hemisphere. And so just by that, maintaining a course with the rigging of the boat with the visible stars, you could do that. And when you're going south, you'll also see the Southern Cross and can find your way that way. The other technique they would use is to have what they call Itak Island, which would be a reference island for kind of a vectoring, and they would, in a clear night or even in the day, they would be able to see the star setting or the other celestial body, which would be in line with the Itak Island, and then at an angle you could find your way to the goal island. So this was a kind of trigonometry that was instinctual and visual without, let's say, the mathematics, but this meant that considering the winds and the currents, then they could find their way to their goal by observing other directions and other signs. So this is where it became sort of a holistic way to find your way across the sea. The other way was to watch the birds, and we can see this out here. When we start seeing birds, we know we are near some land, and in the evening particularly, they will go to their nesting, or they will, if they have food in their mouth, then they're obviously going back to feed their young. And some birds are more reliable than others. Arctic tern will go from the Arctic all the way down to the North Pacific and down into the South Pacific. Others, like the frigate bird, stay up for a long time. They don't nest except very remote islands. But again, the direction that the bird goes was noted in this chart, all of the different names for the horizons and directions in the Polynesian language. And the other thing they would use is cloud formations. So here's a view in Moorea of the clouds that cling on the top of high mountains. And so by studying the way those look out at sea, you can have a sense of where land is. If it's a calm day, you'll get the kind of eyebrows up there on the left, or you'll get a bigger cloud formation over an island. If it's a larger island, sometimes if it's wind, it'll be blown away. Atolls do not have this capability, but you can see this is Raiatea or Ta'a, actually, and so the clouds are very much an indicator of where land is. Even when it's overcast, you can read the clouds and see, in this case, a thickening that will indicate that land is over there. So there are a lot of mirages. I'm going to show you a couple of Fata Morgana, which is the Morgan's fate of being lost in a mirage at sea. And so these are actual photographs of illusions at sea, depending on the layers of temperature of the air over the sky. And so you can easily be fooled, just like out in the desert you see water, out at the sea you see land. This is one ship that was passing by, but by the nature of the air at the time, it was multiplied out over the sea. And here's a picture actually out of Alaska with mountains on the shore, but look what happened when the cold air came in and distorted the whole visual look of it. Well, this is a thing that you get used to at sea. You start to notice things very far away, and then you have to check to see whether they're actually real. In this case, this is a field of floating pumice. This is in Tonga, there had been a eruption on one of the new islands being created there, and so the sailor came across and found the sea covered with floating rocks. And actually the Polynesians knew of this phenomena. If they found that in the ocean, they knew they were near an active volcano somewhere over the horizon. They also would make floats out of pumice rock. They'd find them floating in the ocean and tie them up and use them as fishing floats. The other part of all this is the currents, which are running in mostly a clockwise fashion on the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere, with the equatorial currents running east and west depending on your latitude. Now this is just a general sketch of it. In reality, it often shifts with the decadal oscillation of the ocean. Sometimes it ends up going another way, and so it's not completely set in water. But if you know your waters where you are, you can see the current, you can see the swell, the wind effect on it. And so this was the other major piece of knowledge that was given to David Lewis, is how do you read the ripples in the water? Now the top surface ripples will be caused by the local wind, but the swell will be generated by storms far away, or else they'll be reflected around islands. The bigger swells like we had off of in the Tasman Sea were generated by the Southern Ocean, and 1,000 miles away the ship was riding over them. In the old term, they used to call that the dog running before his master, meaning a big swell would mean that's where the storm is coming from, so you really ought to go the other way if you can. But in this, just looking at the water, you can see the multiplicity of effect that current, swells, waves, wind have on the water, and then you can judge where you are relative to nearby land by that, because you'll get a running swell, let's say in this case from the east, that will be reflected off of an island over the horizon, and you'll be able to tell that you're getting the reflection of that off the island, and as you go around the island, you'll get it on your either side of your vessel. Even an atoll will have that, where you have reflected swell, and then you have eddies. You see the D's in this illustration mean that there will be a back eddies from that swell. And if you're out of the side of land, you can just look at the water and say, well, I must be in this relative position, let's say in this case between two different islands where the reflective waves cross over in the sea, and then you know you're nearby but you're between islands. And so this gets quite complicated, and very sensitive observation is required. So you have, in these different views of it, you'll have the main swell, you'll get another swell coming from the west, maybe from a storm, and then you'll get all these complicated waters that will then indicate where you may be. This was trained on land usually. And here again, in earlier days in Polynesia, they came across navigators, wayfinders being trained with what they call a star chart and a wave chart sometimes. And these were a monadic device. They were not actually a map. They were there to say, if you follow this line of wind or swell, you will get to that island. They were never taken on board to refer to. They were your instruction that you had to memorize and be able to recall so that you could judge your circumstances. On some islands, they would build a teaching area that was an island surrounded by different stones and different indicators of waves. Here, the center of it is the sea god that young woman was sitting on, and being told, how do you judge the waves coming this way, that way, and the reflected waves and the other complicated signs that are in the water. Now this is being taught again in the revival of Polynesian navigation, led by the rebirth of the knowledge that Tavake and other elders had still had, and then the reconstruction of some of these great voyaging canoes has been the great news in the Pacific Polynesia in recent years. And I refer to Maui's hook, which you've seen all around. Every sailor, if you want to be safe, has to wear one. But it's the story of the demigod Maui, who was a bit of a trickster and a bad boy, but he would go out and lead his canoe, and when he was looking for land, he'd take his hook and he would throw it in the water, say a prayer, and bring a new island up. Well, this is considered mythology, but except it probably may be somewhat true, because if you are out there long enough and you are desirous enough of some land and you haven't perished yet, you will probably find land. And visually, land looks like it rises from the sea. So it's not an inaccurate view of how life is. But when they built these big voyaging canoes, there was a lot of ceremony and spirituality attached to it, especially the early, what they call the founding voyagers, who would then go out and find whole new groups of islands. Now, this is the famous artist Herb Kane of Hawaii describes how the Tahitian voyagers came up and they found the great volcanic islands and the drama of Hawaii 1,000 miles away, and then set up their own Polynesian culture, which was probably the greatest single unit of Polynesia other than New Zealand in the sense of population and variety of land and cultural depth. And so this is mythologized quite a bit. Here's a fuzzy edition of the discovery of New Zealand by Kane, Atearoa, and where they're all starving, they finally see land, like many a voyager. But when Captain Cook and others came to New Zealand, they were amazed at the size of these canoes. Some of them were more ceremonial or just for warfare rather than voyaging, because when Kune came to New Zealand in about 1000 AD, he then went back to Hawai'i, which is in central Cook Islands maybe, and he described this vast land, and then he was the instigator of other groups that went and settled New Zealand, though Kune himself never came back. And there's a saying in Maori, "O hoke Kune," when will Kune himself come back and help us discover more land? Well, then the Europeans arrived and things changed quite a bit. These are recreations of the great gathering of canoes and hospitality and or animosity toward the European incursions. But again, the canoe culture was very lush at that time, the big canoes and the trade between the islands, warfare between them. And then as time went on, that faded with other means. But the question of what led the Polynesians to go so far is still active research. And of course, you know Kon-Tiki and Thor Heyerdahl's premise as a young archaeologist. He went and lived in the Marquesas, and he felt that the Polynesians definitely came from South America because the winds are from the east, and it's easy to build a raft and go downwind sailing, which is what he did in 1946. He got balsa wood and a big rig, and that's Kon-Tiki, his imagined god from the highlands of Peru, who told his people to go into the sea and then discover Polynesia. Well, he did do this great adventure, which was world famous, and maybe you all had the book as a kid, where he drifted out into the Humboldt Current, and then he drifted on the waves and the wind all the way to Puka Puka, and then finally made it to Polynesia, proving that you can go that far. The problem is that the Polynesian heritage was always coming from the west to the east. But Thor Heyerdahl and his intrepid Norse proved that it could be done, even if that's not what probably happened. And that's a great adventure and it's been made into a few movies. But this is what's happened since then, the rebuilding of some of the great voyaging canoes. This is in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Voyaging Society. Hoku'a'lea is the Arcturus zenith star for the big island of Hawaii. And so this was built to try to recreate this voyaging navigation tradition. As I said, too many academics had written books about it, but none of them had actually been to sea and tried to test any of this. So a group in Hawaii built the first models of it. They had the designs from previous documentation, and they built a big fiberglass one, and they tested out rigging. They didn't want to make it completely without some modern cordage and structural strength, though. Their first attempts went out and they got capsized, and they had quite a bit of trial and error until they finally built the one that made it to Tahiti. And this was very big news in the 70s and 80s when they finally got the ship together and they got the crew and they went out and voyaged all the way to Tahiti. And I've been on this craft. It has no shelter. It's when you get the full crew on, it's pretty crowded. Everybody takes turns sleeping and things like that. It's not meant for cold weather. And it became the source of pride for the native Hawaiians who, at a certain point, didn't want any haole foreigners or European ancestry people on board. So there was a lot of contentious cultural quality as they got this thing rigged and set, and then they went out. But you can see solar panels and the plastic buckets. It's not completely traditional. But they were followed by another vessel to see whether they were all right. But they took a navigator who came from the Santa Cruz Islands named Mua, who said, even though he had never been to Hawaii or to Tahiti, he said he studied the stars, and he said, I will take you there. And they went for the 1,000-mile journey all the way to Tahiti using the sails, no engine, no compass, no radio. And they made it all the way to Tahiti, and the Tahitian government made a national holiday, and some 70,000 people came down to the shore to greet them. And at the time, they would have to cross the doldrums, follow the trade winds, look at the stars, decide where they were, and they finally made it all the way to Tahiti using these traditional techniques. So this is back in 1976 was the first voyage. Then they sailed all the way back, and then subsequently they sailed around the world even. They sailed into San Francisco, and then they came even into New York, and I sailed on the boat in New York, and it was November, and I said, boy, you really better go south soon, and they went down, not, again, using all Polynesian techniques. They went through the Panama Canal, and they sailed back to Hawaii all the way around the world, proving that it can be done. This was the great leader, Nainua Thompson, who was the Hawaiian Navigator at the original voyages, and then his wife, Solilongo. And now, traditionally, the men were the navigators because they were said to be equipped with the proper nautical equipment to sense the waves in particular. So a man would stand out on the bow in his loose clothes, and he has delicate, sensitive things that would sway, and that's how he would be able to really feel the sea. And of course, women have other sensitive parts too, so it's now shared as a profession. But all through Polynesia, the revival of Polynesian culture via this navigation rediscovery and re-exploration has led to a considerable bit of pride. This is the effigy of Tongaru and the Marquesas, the god of the sea. And Temeha, the original settler in the Marquesas at about 150 A.D., who sailed all the way against the wind to find the Marquesas. So these are by far the greatest of navigators that could go so far with so little and make a whole new land for their people. And now you have all these younger generation that are studying this and feeling proud of their heritage. They may be nominally Christian, but they also are proudly Polynesian, and they're restudying a lot of this lore and mythology, which makes a great deal of pride on part of these people. So the transmission has been made now into a whole new era. Of course, things like tattoo and tourism, all that is the outcome of a lot of it. But boat building is very popular all through the islands, and boat races are suddenly the sport of the sea here, as it traditionally was. However, they might be made out of fiberglass and modern materials. But this is, again, in the Marquesas, just to say the local, let's say, boat culture is quite alive and well. Also in New Zealand, they built these great war they call them. You can see some of them in the Wellington Museum, had beautiful ones, but these are again, a matter of great pride among the Maori and the Polynesian people, sort of like dragon boat races. And yes, he is glad to be aboard. And then other Polynesian culture is spread around the world. Paddle boarding, windsurfing, it's all over the place. And so the Polynesians are definitely taking over much to our recreational pleasure here. And this is just a living culture which continues to develop. Though if you haven't seen this movie, I recommend it, because this is the Disney version of all that I've been talking about the young woman who's going to go voyaging, and she has her rather large sidekick Maui and his big hook, and it's fantastic film of coming of age and going out into the world and being empowered and all the usual suspects. But it's a great movie because the water is considered to be alive, and it speaks to them, and it comes up and helps them. And it's they have all the comedy and the music and all the whole thing. But this has been dubbed into Maori and all the other variations of Polynesian language, Hawaiian, and so this has become a staple of our current time. And then they have the great gatherings of the voyaging canoes every year in different island groups. So this is very much a fresh culture that is ancient at the same time. And so I'll just leave you with one last saying of the Maori chant when you're out at sea: let the calm be widespread, and let the sea glisten like green jade, and let the shimmering warmth of summer ever dance across your sea path. I wish you a great voyage onward. Thank you very much.